hopefully, I don't know if you're familiar with my YouTube content. It's called The Glass Blind Spot.
Yes, of course.
Okay,
yes,
well,
it's excellent.
Well, thank you very much.
Wonderful work. It's detailed and precise and really good, well argued.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we've all got I hate to use that sort of feminist analogy of like the tapestry, but I think that's it. Is if I tried to sort of do something that maybe just wasn't been done that much, which is maybe just a little bit more sort of documentary style,
yes.
And particularly, I think it kind of weaves in slightly with your talk about the importance of there's so much information there in history, and I think the Jess Phillips stuff I did as an example of that simply just by documenting it, a few years later the narrative has changed, but the evidence is there to,
I absolutely agree.
Point.
Yeah, really useful.
Hi, so pleasure to have you here. One of the things that I think a lot of us struggle with when we're dealing with this is that the current political zeitgeist encapsulates basically feminist narrative, as you know. For those of us, especially if we don't have a historical backing or anything like that, in order to sift through all of the information, we had one writer go over and talk about a lot of the classics and how that did that. That stuff is great, but how would you recommend to us to be able to sift through, because Lord Byron, for example, is obvious there, but because that's so shunned in the current political zeitgeist, it's very difficult for us to actually find the information because it's intentionally buried.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. How would you recommend us to sift through and find it so that way we can actually start writing? Because the more of us that actually do this work, it's not just one person, the more of us that actually do this work and sift through it, that sometimes that can be the catalyst that actually allows the change to actually happen, because fighting one person, even if they are as intelligent as you and articulate as you, one person can be more easily taken down. But if they are the spark of a forest fire, if you will, now they have an entirely bigger problem that they have to deal with. I think we're at that point where we're ready for that. How would you recommend for the rest of us who don't have your backing in education to be able to actually sift through the historical narrative and find this so we can actually start writing about it ourselves more effectively?
It is very difficult, and there's no easy answer for sure. I would say that if you're encountering that kind of argument that men have had power since the beginning of time and women never had power, even if you can find one example that you educate yourself about, and you can say, well, I don't know about all of history, but I can say certainly that in the early 1800s, this was the case, or something like that. Often they don't know what they're talking about.
Like brothel workers, Cleopatra, the lady for the leaders in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, stuff like that.
Yeah, even if you have one example that you can bring forward, that vastly complicates the narrative right there. But I would also say, that at some level it doesn't matter. And my answer would be, that even if it were true that up until 1955 or whatever, women had no power, that would not be a reason why any kind of injustice should be perpetrated today. Unless you believe in basing a theory of society on collective vengeance, it's an utterly irrelevant argument to make anyway.
I'm a veteran, so I'm all about the U.S. Constitution's ability to elevate the individual in spite of the state, not necessarily over it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My organization, or the organization I'm involved with, CAFE, every time we tried to have a speaker about men's issues, even a relatively non-controversial sort of speaker like Paul Nathanson, who's written a lot about men's issues, but not even from an anti-feminist perspective necessarily, and who's written about public misandry, and we tried to bring him in, and black-clad, mask-wearing, Antifa-style protesters tried to prevent him from being able to speak at the University of Ottawa. That's happened over and over again, and it happens. The protesters are able to shut down talks with impunity. The administration sort of feels, we're not going to touch them. If we had been a feminist group having a talk about girls and women and their issues, and some other group had tried to shut us down, a conservative religious group or something, the university administration would have had no trouble calling in the police and having us handcuffed and taken away. But if it's a men's issues organization, the idea is that they are fascist. That it's good to prevent them, and so definitely the anti-male mood on university campuses, I think, is inarguable.
I wouldn't have been able to speak with such conviction and knowledge if it hadn't been for the many men who have contacted me over the years and who have shared their stories, their heartbreaking stories, and had made me aware that our movement is not only about obviously, it's not only about rights and issues in the kind of general social, legal sphere, but is about male humanity, the need to recognize that, and about the many hearts that have been broken in our era.
I think just even, kind of from personal experience of kind of growing up, and you are fed certain stories, and they may or may not be accurate, and then you learn more, and you process your decision. I think that, there is a thing about kind of as people grow older, they maybe become more conservative as opposed to liberal. So there's that sort of aspect. Yeah,
there's that for sure.
But certainly kind of at the minute, that is the big kind of narrative. And it's very hard sort of, even if you don't believe it or support it, I think as young people, it may be very difficult to push against it. So I wanted to kind of lead into your talk, and something that it was a powerful talk, as always, because I really enjoyed your last talk in London. Was extremely informative as well, and particularly about the level of how overt the prejudice, how overt the discrimination, the language is. And to me, my background and my kind of belief in terms of principles and values, has led me to work in equality of opportunity and sort of that sort of legal framework. And clearly, in terms of the kind of there are some areas of rights where men do not have the same rights as women, and that clearly is an issue.
And he then goes on in the book to explain, chronicling in great detail, the long-standing female legal privileges in his society, England at the turn of the 20th century, showing how in the areas of marriage rights, divorce, alimony, child custody, criminal prosecutions generally, capital punishment in particular, sexual assault law, infanticide, and many other specific areas of criminal law, men were legally as well as socially hugely disadvantaged. As a barrister with an intimate familiarity with legal cases and legal philosophy, he chronicled outrageous miscarriages of justice attributable to the sentimental conviction that no matter the specific circumstances, women were always innocent victims, no matter what they'd done, what heinous crimes they had committed. He noted, for example, that in cases of domestic dispute, here it is, personal violence on the part of the husband is severely punished. On the part of a wife, she will be let off with impunity. And he went.
But in terms of kind of so much of the on-paper legislation, it protects everybody from discrimination. And kind of, so I have a sunny disposition, and I kind of like to think that, okay, so we're going through this kind of period, but it's getting so ridiculous that at some point, kind of the people who are in government and in these equality organisations who are responsible for those laws that say that men and women are must have equal rights, have to start kind of addressing this overt misandry. Now,
I hope so.
Yes. No. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
no. But my question is, you have a very pessimistic view of that.
Yeah.
And the people that I respect most in kind of this whole movement, most of them do have, and I think it's much more realistic perspective. It's a long.
I mean, we don't know the future. Don't know. We don't even know what'll happen next year, and so that's the thing that I try to keep in mind because I do often feel. I feel frustrated, I feel angry, I feel despairing, really, because it sometimes seems as if there is just no length to which the radical feminist lobby can't go that won't get quite a lot of public support, or at least, acquiescence. Maybe it's not support, but it certainly is acquiescence, and by men too.
I am often informed by friends that the tide is turning, that the end of feminism's hold on the public imagination is drawing near. And while I always hope to be wrong, I would love it if every single one of my friends could say, "See, Fiamengo, you were always the naysayer, you were always the skeptic." I would love that. But I have to say, I don't really think we are at the end, or even at the beginning of the end, or even, as Winston Churchill said, the end of the beginning. I think we're in the grip of a very long-standing and extremely powerful social phenomenon. But I do think that if we are to make our best case, I'm causing my mic to, I do think, my last sentence, if we are going to make our best case for defeating feminism, it helps us to know something about the full extent of its fraudulent claims about the past.
I've talked to many men who, wonderful men that I like very much, who are pro-feminist, and I don't understand why. We'll be talking about due process, for instance, and they'll say, but a lot of women are raped, and what's that got to do? And I remember one said to me, and they don't get justice in the courts, and I didn't really know what to say to that. Well, that's true. I'm sure I know there are cases, but so what? So that means that therefore it's okay that some innocent men should be punished to sort of make up for the fact that some guilty men went free. I mean, that is the fundamental principle of Western democracy, is the idea that it's better that a guilty person would go free than that an innocent person should be imprisoned or in any way, punished. Yet we seem to have now decided that really it's actually okay if a few innocent, as long as it's men who are being imprisoned or losing their jobs or having their livelihoods destroyed or having their reputations destroyed or being shamed publicly, that's okay, because it's all in a good cause. And I've met many, many men who seem to go along with that, and that's why it struck me so powerfully when I read the E. Belford Bax book, which I should have read years ago, because Lucian Volson, who you probably know, a men's activist in Romania, who has a YouTube channel, he recommended that book to me years ago, and I never read it, and so I just read it recently, and this is published in 1913, and he himself made that case that feminism has a huge disproportionate impact on society because men support anything that's perceived to be good for women, even if it isn't actually.
Yes.
It will be supported by a lot of women and also by a lot of men.
Bax's book is a fascinating corrective to those of us who tend to think, as I think many of us do, that men's problems mainly stem from second-wave feminism, or who imagine that at some point in the past, feminism was a worthy movement, innocent of anti-male animus. As Bax saw it, feminism was, from the beginning, an irrational phenomenon that capitalized on female in-group solidarity and on man's inability to care for his fellow man. And Bax described the problems as follows, and it's amazing to think that this was 1913. He said, while modern feminism has succeeded in establishing a powerful sex solidarity amongst a large section of women as against men, there is not only no sex solidarity of men as against women, but on the contrary, the prevalence of an altogether opposed sentiment. In any conflict of interest between a man and a woman, male public opinion, often in defiance of the most obvious considerations of equity, sides with the woman, and glories in doing so.
And it's almost instinctual. You have
it seems to be just something deep in
nature as well as nurture.
Which is what shows the feminist lie, which the feminist lie is always that men hate women, men resent women, men see women as the other, and that is in some way disgusting, or they project everything that they don't like about themselves and about nature onto women. It couldn't be further from the truth. It's the opposite. Men tend to idealize women. I've talked to so many men who talk about, the wonderful, the beauty of the feminine and how important women are in society. And I guess I'm a bit of the opposite, because I tend to idealize men. But in terms of social structures and creating a flourishing, stable society, I feel a lot better when I am working under male authority, or where I know that men are the ones that are sort of in charge of these larger structures, because I've seen the way that women's infighting and emotionality and over-personalizing of things. Those are good in the home. They're good in interpersonal relationships sometimes, but in terms of managing companies or getting things accomplished, running government,
that's it. There are traits, and because obviously females, kind of traits that are viewed as more masculine kind of thing, and that it's not that perfection, but you have that kind of yin and yang thing, I understand that the lack of cohesion now is creating difficulties. I wanted to actually ask you something about women now. The thing that strikes me as sort of most remarkable about this movement is I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't believe, feel.
I know.
And it's not that equally the same.
No.
Just that principle of equal rights.
Each person has equal value. Each person deserves equality of opportunity. I've never met anybody who didn't. I've had thousands of men write to me since I began making public talks. Not one ever said, I really think women should stay in the home. Well, I've met a few who think women are better off in the home. But, very few would deny a brilliant woman the opportunity to make her contribution to society. Nobody's going to say, Madame Curie should not do.
Absolutely not. And that kind of self-determination of kind of whatever a person wants to do. And if a man wants to be the main caregiver at home,
nobody objects to these things. And yet that's the thing that feminists bang
that's
on
the narrative.
About all the time. Oh, these men, they're full of hatred, they're this and that. No, they're not. I have not met these men, and they're not here, they're not anywhere. What I see in men is decent people who want to make a good society, who love women, who want society to be safe and want women to be able to flourish, and who also, I hope, want men to flourish as well. And I see nothing but generosity, benevolence, a desire for cooperation between the sexes. Most men want to make a life with women, at least as partners in work and life, and many want to marry and have children. And unfortunately, I can't say that about women in the feminist movement, or even the women who have been affected by the feminist movement.
But then he identified two types of feminism, which I think are also relevant for our own discussions. Two types of feminism that already in 1913 had taken deep root in British society. One he called political feminism. This was a feminism claiming that against any evidence to the contrary, women and men were fundamentally equal in all things if women weren't, better than men. And then the other kind of feminism he called sentimental feminism. And that feminism claimed, against all evidence to the contrary, that women deserved, because of their nature and situation, special privileges, advantages, sympathy, leniency, etc., that weren't given to men. And he pointed out that though these two forms of feminism were diametrically opposed and self-contradictory, they almost always operated together in tandem in the same individual or in the same organization, and that the contradiction did not weaken feminism's power in society by one iota.
There's a lot of wonderful individual women. I don't hate women. I like lots of women, but I see a lot of anger, a lot of unfair blaming of men, a lot of preference for females, a lot of that sort of rah, women are better, women do this better, women do business better, women are more cooperative.
Centuries of oppression, it's our turn.
It's our turn now, step back men, let us women come forth. That's just bigotry.
It is.
And it should be called out as bigotry, and yet it's celebrated all the time. It makes me sick.
He took pains to point out the depths of anti-male bigotry and gynocentric prejudice that operated even amidst otherwise judicious and impartial, fair-minded, generous, humane people. He noted, for example, and this is the, this large quotation here, that one of the proposals which finds most favor with the sentimental feminist is the demand that in the case of the murder by a woman of her illegitimate child, the putative father should be placed in the dock as an accessory. In other words, a man should be punished for a crime of which he is wholly innocent because the guilty person was forsooth a woman. That such a suggestion should be so much as entertained by otherwise sane persons is indeed significant of the degeneracy of mental and moral fiber induced by the feminist movement.
Well, so the core question I wanted to get to on that point, obviously you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, and I presume you're familiar with Elizabeth Hobson from London.
Of course, she's
brilliant.
Wonderful.
Yeah, sadly couldn't make it.
So is Jordan, of course. Nobody would deny that.
We love everybody. She has a quote of his on her Twitter feed, which is "Women reign in your crazy sisters." Okay.
He's good. He's good when he says that.
Yeah, and I think that's part because
men can't do it.
Well, that's it. I personally, and this I don't want to ask your view on this. Personally, I feel, particularly from the feminist perspective, there's this kind of attitude towards the men's rights movement that, well, if you want a shelter, go and build it, kind of thing. You don't do anything. All you do is slag off feminism, kind of thing. But from my perspective, kind of men have a huge amount to contribute to the men's rights movement. But in terms of kind of addressing the feminist movement, that's, it has to come from women. But it has to come from women because it's women that are being represented by.
Yes. Women have to say, you don't speak for me. I think men can also stand up and say, your representation of men is wrong. My father was never like that. My brothers aren't like that. I'm not like that. I think men can do that, but it's hard, and they immediately then get called misogynist and this and that. You're a rape apologist. You're creating a culture of violence, etc., where it's harder for for feminists to turn that back on women. So, women do need to rein in their crazy sisters, as Jordan says.
It always struck resonance with me in terms of that leadership, because clearly women have always been leaders in society as well.
Surely have. They've had incredible moral authority and power.
And that, the moral authority, particularly, and that. I was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah.
Just appreciate your shocking time. I suppose, pessimist picture.
I hope I'm wrong, but when I read that about Bax, talking about the late 19th century and the turn of the century and how all the conditions that we talk about were already in place.
It could have written it yesterday. Absolutely.
He concluded that feminism, the idea that women had always been oppressed and that it was an urgent necessity to remedy that oppression. He concluded that feminism was a species of social hypnotism or mania, a totally irrational sentiment, uninfluenced by reason and impervious to it. He said that while feminism claimed over and over again to have anything to do with equality, this is the last quotation, a very little inquiry into its concrete demands suffices to show that feminism's aim, so far from being equality, is the very reverse, viz. To bring about with the aid of men themselves, as embodied in the forces of the state, a female ascendancy and a consolidation and extension of already existing female privileges. Bax wasn't particularly hopeful about the possibility of reversing what he saw as the mass derangement of thought and feeling that feminism had caused. As he had found, the consistent presentation of evidence showing the falseness of feminist claims had almost no discernible effect on a true believer. And his book, The Fraud of Feminism, provides an interesting glimpse into men's legal history that turns the notion of historic male privilege fully on its head.
Very sobering to read.
Yes, I agree.
Because when you think that second wave feminism went wrong, sometime in the 1970s or 80s, you think, okay, we're in the midst of a 50-year, sort of distortion of society. But he was already talking about these things nearly 150 years ago, and
that's it. And these things are so complicated, and I think that is, one of the reasons why it's sometimes. I think most of society is just like, well, unless it really impacts me, I don't want to, touch this. So I want to ask you, for young men and young women who might watch this, what advice would you give to them about kind of just talking about this subject and about possibly being, taking a risk and being brave about, I know personally when I first started talking to people around me about this subject, there was a kind of an instinctual kind of like, oh, I feel like, kind of people are going to think I hate women, and you have to push past that.
It's hard.
So just what advice would you give to anybody who wants to get involved in this?
I would encourage young women for sure, because I think young women can do it and have a huge impact. I would encourage young women to speak up for what they know is right against feminist excesses and feminist misandry. If they recognize it, they can have a hugely positive impact for good, I believe. For a young man, I think it's a lot more difficult. I wouldn't actually encourage men to speak publicly unless they really know they can do it without, because I wouldn't want, if I were a young man now, I think if I were advising my son, I would say, choose something that you're really passionate about and can do well at, and do that.
Yes.
And be the best and give
do
it
it
your
well.
all and find your life satisfaction that way and protect yourself against feminism. But I would not encourage a young man to go out on a limb to be political, because you can be destroyed.
Yeah, I think that is very sensible advice, sadly.
I mean, it's sad. And
it is.
Yeah, and maybe that maybe some young men really want to become more politically engaged in the men's movement, but I would say it's a lot easier for a young woman.
Yeah.
She's not going to be destroyed. She's going to have pushback, but they can't do to her what they can and do to any young man who dissents in any way from feminist dogma.
Janice, thank you so much. As you know, there are legal challenges against women's studies, and one informal argument that feminists use to defend women's studies is that because history is a male-dominated discipline, that women's studies provides a necessary counterbalance to history departments. Now, this is not a formal legal argument that will ever be entertained in court, but it is still an informal social argument that they use. So I was wondering, what is your response to that feminist argument?
Well, what I've found as I have studied more and more about feminist claims is that every single feminist claim is false, and it simply never has been the case that there was any kind of desire on the part of male scholars or anybody else in society to exclude half of humanity from the historical record or from mythology or religion or the stories we tell about ourselves or anything. And so, it's absolutely nonsense. And that's the thing that I find so dangerous about the general historical ignorance, and I'm speaking about my own historical ignorance more so than anyone else's, is that so often someone will make a claim about that things were thus up until, I remember once, actually Karen and I were at a conference where a woman said that until the 1930s, women were not declared persons in Canada. It was one of the final statements made in the whole conference, and that was just so false. I mean, it's technically true, but there's a long, complicated story about why that was. It had to do with women being eligible to serve on the Senate and a Privy Council decision. It didn't in any way, but I mean, feminists use things like that all the time to shame men, to thinking that their ancestors didn't believe women were human. It had nothing to do with that. Men always knew women were human. So, yeah, it's just nonsense.
If I may, one final question kind of linked on to that, which is, you see the whole kind of the narrative about the kind of white supremacy and the gateway, all this nonsense about kind of, one of the big trend I've kind of noticed over the last year is that subject, kind of pushing that narrative, but also a more acceptance and mainstreaming of men's rights and male inequalities. So by that I mean that a lot of feminists and a lot of, maybe just sort of media, mainstream media, that would have ignored or laughed at International Men's Day, for example, are now kind of embracing it, but in a kind of controlled way. Mm-hmm. So my question is kind of, there's almost kind of like a narrative where you're getting to the kind of the good MRA and the bad MRA.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting, yeah.
And it's such a difficult one.
It is.
Because people can do a lot of good work inside the system, but they don't necessarily, something that struck me that you said last year was that every movement needs its radicals as well as its moderates, kind of.
Yeah.
So just what advice would you give to people that are maybe kind of, well, how do we bridge, make sure that divide doesn't split away?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't have advice, but because it's something I struggle with. Because sometimes, like I've had friends in academia who are talking about race in ways that are unacceptable, in terms of the narrative, and I one in particular who was fired, well, not fired recently, but he took early retirement because he's a critic of multiculturalism and of mass immigration. He's of course called a white supremacist, I don't think he is a white supremacist, but he recognizes differences between races, and he believes that people have the right to not to have their cultures made multicultural by a decision made from above.
Okay.
And so that he argues this, and it's very, very unpopular, even more unpopular perhaps than anti-feminism in academia and in elite culture. And so I defended him. And I did a video about him, and I was attacked by a lot of people who said, "Oh, now you're showing that you're a white supremacist and all that." And it's very worrisome because I'm not a white supremacist. I'm opposed to all race supremacisms, and I don't like that feeling of being, mischaracterized. And I also, it does all sorts of things with your head, because you think, okay, now I'm going to be less effective. I don't want, black men in the men's movement to now think that the movement's been, infiltrated by white supremacists. I don't want them to think that I don't care about them, or that I wouldn't defend them if they're, in a situation where they're being accused of something. So you get into all these weird things, but then at the same time, the other part of me says, I want to be able to talk about things that I believe are true, even if they're outside the acceptable, bubble of what the good men's rights movement. I want to be able to talk about anything.
Yeah.
And so that is the dilemma, and I don't know what the answer is, because we're a very vulnerable movement, and so we don't want to give our critics a lot of ammunition to be able to discredit all the incredible good work that's being done and all the goodwill that exists inside this movement.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, we don't want to be controlled by threats and misrepresentations by our enemies. And I don't really know what the answer is. In a way, maybe, you know, it's non-white men's issues advocates, you know, who can start talking about some of the racial stuff with greater freedom than whites can, and can also give whites permission to talk about a range of issues, because I mean, there is a particular problem, it seems to me, facing white men, which is not to say that black men don't have their issues, nobody denies that, but white men are particularly
demonized.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no public sympathy for them whatsoever. And to ignore that and to pretend that it doesn't exist, well, that's just playing into our enemy's hands too. And yet every time I specify white men, always some people will attack me and say I'm being divisive, but I'm not. I'm trying to recognize the real problems that are there.
Yeah.
But
it's a paradox.
Yeah.
Definitely. But listen, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Let me shake your hand. Yes, well, thank you.
We have time for one more quick question and one more quick answer.
So, thank you, first of all. When discussing feminist history and deconstructing it, it's probably necessary to question their sacred texts. And Karen, you've done an excellent job of doing that with the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848.
Indeed,
but of course, even before that, there's Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And how does that fit into all this? Thank you.
That's a very big question. I haven't read it for a long time. But actually, I mean, Wollstonecraft would not be useful to modern feminists really very much at all, because what she was talking about was educating women to be rational actors in their society. And so in many ways, you know, you could say that Mary Wollstonecraft would be appalled by the direction that modern feminism has moved. So sometimes feminist texts can actually be helpful to our side precisely because they are the few texts where the woman is arguing for genuine equality of opportunity.
Thank you.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.